Hi, my name is Ángela Pérez del Puerto, and I'm going to present the chapter 2.3 on household and family in Europe from 1500s to 2000. In order to introduce the topic, it is important to say that since the 16th century, the way parents and children, as well as husbands and wives, relate to each other serves as the template for how the individual relates to the authority. The organization of society at the family level is clearly fundamental to how European societies have functioned over time. However, these topics were long neglected by historians, relegating them to the field of women's history, which they treated as separate and non-essential. This chapter tries to analyze the setup of care duties often associated with the female roles in society, so that it can help us understand developments in a given period, not just for women themselves, but for societies as a whole, beginning in early modern Europe. To start with childbirth and childhood, it is important to mention that in early modern Europe, there were highly risky periods, but still important changes took place. Studying birth has allowed social historians to reconstruct the particular position that women occupy in early modern families. Childbirth has also given us insight into the anatomical and medical knowledge of the period. In this context, religious dimensions proved to be very important. Early mother mortality rates for mothers and newborns were extremely high, so births were full of religious and magical rituals, such as baptisms, so the newborn could be integrated as soon as possible into the community of believers. Children were born at home with the help of midwives, who mostly passed on their knowledge orally. Since the 17th century, there were also medical books written by midwives, and these works reveal how they dealt with difficult births and also which instruments and manual techniques they used or how they performed emergency baptisms. At the end of the 18th century, responsibilities changed, and midwives had to pass examinations organized by male physicians. Also, the first lying hospitals were established during the 18th century. Throughout Europe, at the beginning of this process of medicalization, the risk of infection in these clinics was extremely high, so that better off women until the 19th century. When it comes to breastfeeding, we see that in some regions, newborns were systematically given to wet nurses. When the Reformation and the Catholic Reform took place, pregnancy outside marriage became a real problem. Until well into the 16th century, a marriage vow and consummation of the marriage were sufficient to declare a marriage legally valid. However, in following decades, ecclesiastical authorities started to require marriages to take place before a priest and in the presence of witnesses. At the same time, they stigmatized extramarital sexual intercourse. And married women who were pregnant assured their good faith and honorable status in church courts, hoping to obtain marriage and recognition for their children, but they were not always successful. Sometimes the social pressure was so great that they saw no other way out than to get rid of the unwanted newborn. That led to many infanticides that were treated as a crime, with differences in persecuting these actions and also differences between urban and rural and Catholic and Protestant areas. This situation also led to the creation of Mary in order to reduce infanticide. In general, childhood was a concept of growing importance in early modern Europe. Children started to gain a status of their own as innocents in need of protection from the adult world in need and in need of education, which was a family affair in this period, especially for girls from the lower classes, but with a clear steady increase in schooling around the age of 6. However, apprentices and periods of servitude long remained a normal part of childhood. With regard to adulthood and household in early modern Europe, both were defined by marriage, work, old age, and death. each of which had an impact on the organization of the household as an institution. The age of consent ranged between 20 and 24 years old, having these ages a direct effect on the number of children women bear. As we said before, marriage took a clear legal and confessional dimension, which officialized many other aspects, such as dowries or divorce. In case of domestic violence or other marital conflicts, divorce was only possible in Protestant countries. In Catholic areas, it was sometimes possible to obtain a dispensation, but after investigations and court trials that provided insights into what early modern people had to say about their everyday married life. Particularly, women went to courts to uphold promises of marriage where they had not been fulfilled, and they were left literally holding the baby. Death was another major factor in adulthood and household life. Life expectancy at birth for the early modern period was around 35 years, but most individuals who survived infancy could expect to live much longer, perhaps to around the age of 60. This also meant that some degree of old age care provision was often necessary. In the Netherlands, for example, some forms of retirement homes emerged. In many other parts of Europe, care by family members remained the norm. Households, of course, existed not only as a set of relationships, but also as tangible material spaces. Young couples needed to procure the material conditions of living together, with basic necessities, including a bed and a fireplace. That led to a growing demand for luxury goods, which contributed to the so-called Industrial Revolution, a shift in which households devoted more time to employment and less to leisure in order to afford luxuries. Moving forward, since the 1800s, improvements in agriculture and the Industrial Revolution had a profound effect on European societies, but also in the way that households and families were organized. Work in cottage industries declined and individuals began to work elsewhere, sometimes far from home. Also, industrial work meant that labor increasingly came to be seen as something performed by male family breadwinners. Even if the important contribution of women and child workers continue, as did the predominance of patriarchy. The Industrial Revolution had profound effects on how households functioned. Remuneration for paid labor became increasingly important as households became less self-sufficient. At the same time, an ideal model of family organization emerged among upper middle class families, whereby men should earn the sole income to support the household, with women focused on the domestic sphere. However, this was only an ideal. In reality, particularly in poor communities, women and children did a lot of work, both in and outside the home. And of course, a male breadwinner household could only exist if the male of the household was alive, and many households, women and children were alone on their own. And in many European countries, such as Spain, Portugal, or France, the concept of the man as an exclusive breadwinner did not become hegemonic in the 19th century. Parallel to this process of industrialization, another significant development emerged: the rise of the modern state, which forced a shift in power over daily affairs from religious institutions to governmental ones. The emergence of new civil codes began to outline how to deal with areas such as marriage, inheritance, adoption, or divorce. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of compulsory civil marriage, which meant that individuals needed to marry through the state, at state registry offices or with judges, rather than through the church. On the other hand, divorce and marital separation moved to the center of debates. Under Catholicism, separation was allowed in cases of marital breakdown, but not divorce. Protestants allowed divorce, but rules were different. Despite what has been said, the impact of the law within the household was limited. Ideas about the role of the husband and father were still predominant, and the law often turned a blind eye to abuse. Also, the laws of many European countries allowed husbands to divorce on grounds of adultery alone, but women were usually required to prove not only adultery, but some other forms of abuse as well, such as living bigamously or committing incest. These uneven power relations in the household also meant that financial decisions, the holding of marital property, and decisions about children were usually in the hands of husbands and fathers. However, there were already efforts by notorious individuals or women's rights groups that questioned these practices of patriarchy. Married women rallied together to call for rights to manage their own finances, to choose whether or not to work, and to have a say, for example, in the education of their children. All the changes mentioned before affected the family relations and the expectations that people had of different family members. First of all, European societies came to perceive a man for one of the children, mostly, but not always, the oldest son. So, therefore, the gender differences among children grew due to a growing emphasis on formal education for boys. Also, more intense care became expected from mothers, who were now supposed to oversee their children's care, upbringing, and education. As a result, supporters of women's education stressed the requirements of motherhood to defend their stance. Secondly, the idea of marriage came to revolve around the notion of a couple that married for love and a woman who voluntarily submitted to her husband's authority and guidance. Novels, poems, operas, and plays helped spread this idea that insisted on emotional and intellectual intimacy, at the same time that continued to be a hierarchical relationship. This gender division of tasks between the couple often increased as productive and political activities moved from households to public spaces. Additionally, political discourses heavily shaped attitudes to the family as well. The home was not to be a political heaven, but a place of patriotic education and sociability. Moreover, pronatalist discourses and policies appear to actively shape family size and lifestyles, as well as opinions and legislation on the suitable age for marriage, the upbringing of the children, and parenting. Not only public institutions participated in this debate, but also legal and medical professionals, charities, social movements such as feminism, and political movements and parties. In this regard, sexual behavior was widely discussed in legal, medical, and religious texts. Behind the proliferation of discourses on issues related to sex and sexual attitude, one can identify new social developments all over Europe related to the immense growth of the urban population. Prostitution, for example, grew radically within European urban environments. Politicians, doctors, journalists, and other intellectuals were preoccupied with the figure of the prostitute, her role in the spread of dangerous venereal diseases such as syphilis, and the moral threat that prostitutes supposedly embodied for European societies. The prostitute, the fallen woman, undermined the moral well being of the middle class and the nation. She thus represented the opposite of the contemporary female ideal of the innocent virgin and of values such as chastity and grace. It is important to mention that in the 19th century, the word prostitution referred not only to women who sold their bodies for sexual services, but was also to describe women who lived with men outside of marriage or who gave birth to illegitimate children. In general, differences between urban and rural areas, as well as between social classes, were decisive for how differences of gender played out in the sexual culture of the 19th century. The last century and a quarter have seen changes in how people organize their household and family life in many terms, such as private daycare facilities, high divorce rates, and married couples, higher life expectancies, single parenting, and so on. The 20th century saw a clear redefinition. Okay. Let's.
Okay. Are you ready?
What? Yes.
From the last century, I think, in this case.
Okay.
Okay.
The last century and a quarter have seen changes in how people organize their household and family life in many terms, such as private daycare facilities, high divorce rates, unmarried couples, higher life expectancies, single parenting, and so on. The 20th century saw a clear redefinition of the boundaries between what was public and what was private, and women opened many doors which had previously been closed. Some women left their homes for public professions, others remained or returned to the private sphere but questioned the positions within it, and others experienced the difficulty of reconciling both options. It was crucial the continuation of the struggle for suffrage. Women from different backgrounds fought for their citizenship, and the women question became a topic that dominated public debates. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, female participation was key to safeguarding the family structure at home or working in factories. Many participated in the war as nurses, even at the front lines of battle. This called into question arguments that had been used in the past to justify their social and legal discrimination and precipitated women's securing of the right to vote in many countries in the 1920s. However, this happened in parallel with the reinstatement of earlier discourses of female domesticity that sent women back to the home to make way for men returning from the front. The rise of fascism in the 1930s led to the strong imposition of a patriarchal model, and in 1939, when World War II started, women were again incorporated into the tasks that men at the front left vacant. They also re-experienced the contradiction of public policies when, as war came to a close in 1945, governments once again asked them to return to the home to become the ideal modern housewife, who was often portrayed as a fulfilled woman surrounded by washing machines and stoves. However, many women had embarked in a one-way journey out of the domestic sphere. This situation reinforced the second feminist wave in the 1960s, which emphasized cultural challenges and the weight of gender constructions. This path led to an unstoppable rise in the access of women to the world of non-domestic work. But at the same time, it revealed certain challenges that remain unresolved even at the end of the century. In particular, the double burden of balancing professional and personal life has made it hard to reconcile a maternal desire with work aspirations. Alongside the previous feminine processes, in many European countries, marriage and family law before World War I experienced a push to democratize divorce and make it more accessible, as well as to improve the rights of women within and beyond marriage, such as holding property in their own names. However, both world wars and the long period of economic decline between them generated reactions against the growing role of women outside the home and the supposed breakdown of what many perceive as the traditional family. In the interwar period, a number of different measures around Europe encouraged families to have more children and women to stay at home or to prevent married women from taking. Therefore, progressive campaigns related to marriage and family law continue in parallel with movements that wanted to preserve what was seen as a traditional family. In fact, the period after 1945 continued to be characterized by the tension between conservatism around the family and calls for loosening restrictions. Some of the most significant steps in family law came in the 1990s and 2000s with legislation creating civil partnerships and same-sex marriage. Last but not least, sexuality in the 20th century, especially in the first half, was still understood as the privilege of married couples that were procreative, heterosexual, and monogamous. In the 1920s, psychoanalysts such as Sigmund Freud denounced sexual repression as a source of neurosis. Others promoted birth control, the prevention of prostitution, and the decriminalization of homosexuality. However, in the 1930s, saw a clear step back. For example, Hitler's rise to power put an end to the first wave of emancipation. Interracial relationships were forbidden, and men accused of homosexuality were sent to concentration camps. Another example can be found in 1934, when Stalin's Soviet Union recriminalized both homosexuality and abortion. It was not until the 1960s that many sexual traditional patterns were challenged openly by the scientific field of sexology and the movements associated with 1968. That led to changes such as teaching sex education in schools, limiting or eradicating censorship, or turning sexuality a political question. Another major topic was birth control and abortion. There were among the main demands for the second wave feminist movements, which had been notably influenced by Simone de Beauvoir's essay, The Second Sex, in 1949. Even though birth control in the form of the pill gradually liberated women from the fear of unwanted pregnancies, abortion rights were often only granted after years of struggle in different countries across Europe. On the other hand, the recognition of rights for LGBTQ plus people has been one of the biggest challenges for European societies on the last 50 years. In Western Europe, states began decriminalizing same-sex relations between consenting adults at the end of the 1960s. But it was not until the rise of revolutionary movements for gay and lesbian liberation in the 1970s that the movement found an important place in the political agendas. When the LGBT community was struck by AIDS, new demands emerged in favor of recognizing same-sex relationships through civil unions and same-sex marriage. Lastly, in terms of non-binary gender identities, there is still a long way ahead. Even though some European countries today support transgender rights and acknowledge and facilitate the changing of one's legal gender, despite all that, transgender people still suffer numerous legal and social discriminations. This is all. Thank you so much for listening.